going?
Great. Why? What have you heard?
Blake, over here, what you signing? Blake, over here, what you signing? Blake.
I feel something is brewing and something is about to explode. It was also influenced by Blake Lively's narrative.
Before any legal context entered the conversation, Blake Lively's public image was carefully constructed and widely reinforced by media coverage, brand partnerships, and long-term visibility in Hollywood. She was consistently framed as approachable, intelligent, and culturally polished, an actress who balanced mainstream success with a sense of personal authenticity. Her alignment with major fashion houses and lifestyle brands positioned her as dependable and low risk. Unlike many celebrities associated with controversy-driven attention cycles, Blake's image leaned towards stability and discretion. Interviews often emphasized professionalism, humor, and distance from public conflict, which helped solidify a reputation rooted in trust rather than spectacle. Media narratives surrounding Blake also benefited from continuity. Over time, outlets treated her not just as an actress, but as a figure representing taste, restraint, and media savvy. This consistency mattered because credibility in public life is cumulative. When legal scrutiny later emerged, it didn't land on a blank slate. It landed on a persona that had been reinforced for years. That credibility influenced how early coverage was framed. Journalists and commentators often contextualized developments through her established character, rather than through isolated allegations or claims. In reputational terms, Blake entered the situation with a form of narrative capital, one that shaped tone, pacing, and assumptions in the earliest stages of public discussion.
New court filings are pulling Taylor Swift directly into the Blake Lively-Justin Baldoni legal war, revealing private texts that, if true, show Swift maybe siding with Lively, maybe then not, reacting behind the scenes as the controversy was about to explode.
As media attention around Blake Lively increased, coverage began expanding beyond her individual actions to include her high-profile relationships. In celebrity reporting, personal associations often function as contextual signals, shaping how a figure is interpreted during moments of scrutiny. For Blake, this meant that her long-standing connections within elite entertainment circles became part of the narrative landscape. Among these associations, her friendship with Taylor Swift drew particular attention, not because of direct involvement, but because of what the relationship symbolized in media framing. Taylor Swift's public image as a controlled, strategic communicator led some outlets to view the association as reinforcing Blake's positioning within a carefully managed social and professional network. The focus was less on collaboration and more on alignment. Media narratives often use these connections to frame Blake as embedded within an influential ecosystem, one where messaging, visibility, and silence are rarely accidental. This framing subtly shifted coverage from isolated legal context toward broader questions of influence and media awareness, with Blake remaining the central subject of analysis. Importantly, these associations were presented as contextual background rather than causal factors. Coverage generally avoided attributing responsibility to her connections, instead using them to illustrate the environment Blake operates within, one shaped by access, shared public relations instincts, and an understanding of how narratives evolve under pressure. As reporting around Blake Lively's situation progressed, attention gradually shifted from public statements and appearances to references involving private message exchanges. These messages did not initially appear as a central focus, but entered the conversation through secondary reporting, commentary, and contextual analysis tied to broader media narratives. Coverage emphasized the timing of these messages rather than their content. Their emergence coincided with heightened public interest, making them notable as part of the information environment surrounding Blake rather than as standalone developments. In this sense, the messages functioned as narrative signals, suggesting behind-the-scenes communication during a period of increased scrutiny.
Taylor Swift and Blake Lively text messages are finally here.
What drew attention was not the existence of private messaging itself, which is common in high-profile circles, but the way these exchanges were framed in relation to Blake's decision-making and awareness. Media outlets often position the messages as illustrative, offering insight into how information may have been processed privately while public silence or restraint was maintained. Importantly, reporting generally stopped short of treating the messages as definitive or evidentiary. Instead, they were presented as contextual elements that added texture to Blake Lively's coverage, reinforcing her central role in the unfolding narrative without altering the formal boundaries of the legal discussion. As references to private messages circulated, interpretation quickly became the dominant frame, with Blake Lively positioned at the center of that process. Rather than focusing solely on what was said, commentators and journalists analyzed how the messages fit into Blake's broader public conduct, timing, and strategic choices. Media coverage often approached the messages through inferred intent. Analysts asked how Blake's role, visibility, and prior media behavior aligned with the existence of private communications, using her established reputation as the primary lens. This placed emphasis on interpretation over verification, with Blake's actions becoming the anchor point for discussion. Audience reactions followed a similar pattern. Online discourse rarely treated the messages in isolation, instead folding them into existing perceptions of Blake as a calculated or media-aware figure. Supportive interpretations highlighted professionalism and discretion, while more skeptical readings framed the messages as part of narrative management. In both cases, Blake remained the focal subject. This phase marked a shift in coverage from reporting developments to evaluating meaning. The messages became less about their factual boundaries and more about what they suggested regarding Blake Lively's approach to public scrutiny, reinforcing her centrality in how the situation was understood and debated. As coverage diversified across platforms, differences in tone became increasingly noticeable, with Blake Lively's perceived intent taking precedence over the specific details being reported. Rather than centering analysis on the messages themselves, many outlets framed the story around Blake's level of agency within the situation. Some publications adopted a restrained, contextual approach, emphasizing Blake's experience in managing public attention and interpreting her actions as consistent with long-established media discipline. In these cases, her influence was portrayed as structural, rooted in familiarity with public scrutiny rather than active intervention. Other outlets leaned into a more speculative framing, highlighting Blake's visibility, connections, and timing as indicators of influence.
Baldoni had been waging a smear campaign against Lively. Swift writing, "I think this expletive knows something is coming because he's gotten out his tiny violin."
This coverage focused less on documented actions and more on inferred capability, suggesting that her position alone carried narrative weight. The distinction lay not in accusation, but in emphasis. Across both approaches, Blake remained the central figure through which influence was assessed. The variation in framing revealed how media narratives can shift focus from concrete content to perceived power, illustrating how Blake Lively's role was interpreted differently depending on editorial perspective and audience expectations. Following the circulation of message-related reporting, public reaction became an increasingly visible component of Blake Lively's coverage. Online discourse expanded across social platforms, with discussions centering less on confirmed details and more on how the information fit existing perceptions of Blake's public persona. Social media narratives showed a clear split in tone. Some audiences interpreted the developments as consistent with Blake's long-standing image of discretion and control, viewing the situation as an example of heightened scrutiny rather than substantive change. Others expressed curiosity or skepticism, framing the reports as moments that invited closer examination of her media presence. Importantly, engagement levels increased without a corresponding shift toward consensus. Commentary remained speculative, often driven by interpretation rather than new information. Blake continued to function as the focal point, with reactions tied to her perceived intentions, silence, and past behavior. This phase illustrated how audience sentiment can evolve without formal developments. For Blake Lively, public reaction reflected a recalibration rather than a reversal, an adjustment in how viewers assessed her role within the narrative, while still anchoring discussion around her credibility and visibility. As message-related narratives circulated, their intersection with Blake Lively's legal situation remained largely indirect, yet they quickly became a focal point in public discussion. Media coverage consistently distinguished between the formal legal framework, court filings, motions, and evidentiary standards, and the broader reputational conversation occurring in parallel. Reported messages were highlighted in reporting and commentary as contextual material rather than as documents submitted or recognized in court. This distinction was emphasized repeatedly to clarify that these narratives were interpretive rather than legally binding. From a strictly legal perspective, the messages functioned more as background context than as material influence. Coverage reinforced that they were not presented as evidence, did not directly inform judicial decisions, and could not be considered determinative of any legal outcome. By maintaining this separation, reporting preserved the procedural boundaries between what was publicly discussed and what carried official legal weight. reducing the risk of conflating speculation with formal adjudication. Reputationally, however, the presence of message-related narratives had a subtler yet meaningful effect. The discussion shaped perceptions of Blake's composure, timing, and strategic awareness during a period of scrutiny. Observers, commentators, and audiences used these reports to gauge how she navigated public and private communication, even in the absence of any direct legal consequences. The focus was less on culpability and more on perception management, how Blake's behavior and choices reflected on her credibility, influence, and ability to maintain a controlled public image under pressure. This created a dual-track effect. Legally, the process remained procedural and unaffected. Reputationally, Blake's situation was reframed through associative interpretation. Media coverage, online discourse, and public speculation collectively shaped the environment in which her legal posture was evaluated, illustrating how peripheral narratives can affect perception without altering formal outcomes. In essence, the messages served as a lens through which her actions were analyzed, contributing to a nuanced understanding of Blake Lively as both a public figure and a subject of legal scrutiny. As public attention around Blake Lively intensified, her approach to visibility became a central element in how narratives unfolded. Rather than addressing message-related reports directly, Blake maintained a measured public presence, offering minimal statements and carefully selecting when and where to appear. This deliberate restraint shaped both the pace and tone of media coverage, emphasizing observation over reaction. Media outlets frequently interpreted this silence as intentional, framing it as consistent with Blake's established communication style. Over the years, she has cultivated a reputation for managing her public image through selective engagement rather than immediate response. By avoiding direct commentary, she limited opportunities for speculation to escalate, allowing ongoing discussions to circulate without being reinforced by new statements. When public appearances did occur, coverage treated them as symbolic rather than reactive. Analysts and journalists focused on timing, setting, and demeanor, interpreting even minor actions as signals about her composure and approach. The emphasis on continuity and normalcy subtly redirected media momentum, shifting attention from conjecture towards structured observation of her behavior. This controlled strategy ultimately influenced the rhythm of coverage. Without frequent or reactive statements to drive headlines, public attention gradually dispersed, demonstrating how strategic silence can operate as an active tool for managing scrutiny. For Blake Lively, this approach reinforced her long-term reputation for discretion while shaping the environment in which her public narrative continued to evolve.
Oh, that's too bad. She's so funny.
She's funny.